Hey guys, tonight we're tracing the roots of something absolutely massive. How a soggy little island off the coast of Europe somehow managed to plant its flag on every continent, change global trade, redraw borders, and teach half the planet how to queue properly. That's right, we're diving into the entire history of why the British came to rule the world. Picture this: mist curling across sheep-covered hills, muddy rivers sloshing through forests, and a dozen squabbling tribes arguing over who gets to wear the fanciest cloak. There are no skyscrapers, no Buckingham Palace, and absolutely no tea. It's cold, chaotic, and if you're lucky, you die of natural causes instead of a battle axe to the face. This is where it all begins. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this part. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love seeing just how far this sleepy little channel has traveled. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, the island. It's called Britannia by the Romans, but long before Latin ever gets a foothold. It's a wild mix of Celts, Picts, and a bunch of people who really hate their neighbors. There's no concept of England or Scotland, just dozens of tribes with local gods, warrior kings, and some seriously questionable hairstyles. Most of Europe at this point is building empires, writing poetry, or getting crucified by the Romans. Meanwhile, Britain's offering up mud huts and war paint. And yet, there's something here, something oddly durable. When Julius Caesar first tries to invade in 55 BCE, he's basically showing off. He lands, fights a few skirmishes, then sails back with a shrug. It's not until nearly a century later, in 43 CE, that Rome properly invades, and even then, it takes them years to tame the island. Well, tame is generous. They build roads, bathhouses, Hadrian's Wall to keep the northern tribes out, and try to introduce wine to people who'd rather drink mead out of skulls. But Rome never really conquers the soul of Britain. They leave behind towns, Latin names, and some very confused locals. Then, in the early 400s, the empire collapses, and the Romans pack up their sandals and leave. Cue the first major reality check. Without their colonizers, the locals promptly forget how to maintain roads, fight off invaders, or even run their baths. Within a generation, it's back to tribal chaos. And into that power vacuum storm the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes tribes from what's now Germany and Denmark. They don't ask permission. They burn, conquer, and settle, slowly morphing into what we now call the Anglo-Saxons. From them we get the language, the legal customs, and the deeply English habit of looking slightly confused, but carrying on anyway. Meanwhile, up north, the Scots and Picts are doing their own thing, raiding, resisting, and occasionally uniting when someone invades. Ireland, untouched by Rome, becomes a center of monastic scholarship, while the rest of the Isles are still squabbling over whose ox was stolen. Now, here's a fringe tidbit for you. During the so-called Dark Ages, England may have had more petty kingdoms than public wells. Some estimates say up to 7 major kingdoms: Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex. Yes, Essex. You're not imagining it. That county used to be an actual kingdom with its own crown. And somewhere between all these territories, war never really stopped. Yet even amid all this mess, something quietly important is happening. A sense of identity, tiny, fragile, is forming. Christian missionaries arrive from Ireland and Rome, and over time Christianity becomes the new glue. They build monasteries, teach Latin, and introduce the idea that perhaps stabbing your neighbors over sheep isn't the most productive use of your Sunday. And then come the Vikings. Oh boy. Starting in the late 700s, Norse raiders begin hitting monasteries like Lindisfarne, stealing gold, enslaving monks, and burning anything not nailed down. Over the next 2 centuries, the Danes don't just raid, they set. Large parts of England fall under the Danelaw, a region where Norse customs and language take root. They bring with them new farming techniques, new gods for a while, and an appetite for sea power. It's the first real naval culture Britain sees, and ironically, it's foreign. Historians still argue whether the Viking invasions unified England out of necessity, or simply forced the stronger kingdoms to absorb the weaker ones. Either way, by the time we reach the 10th century, there's one kingdom rising above the rest. Wessex, under King Alfred the Great, starts pushing back against the Vikings. Alfred, yes, the one with the burned cakes, reorganizes the military, builds fortified towns called burhs, and creates a kind of tax system. He's one of the first rulers to realize that bureaucracy can beat brute force. It's slow, boring, and involves lots of counting, but it works. By the year 1000, England is starting to look like a country. Not a powerful one, not a rich one, but a country. There's still a king, a council, a sense of law, and when Danish King Cunit, yes, that's Sunit, conquers England in 1016, he keeps most of the local structures. Why reinvent a system that's already annoyingly functional? The real surprise: the English don't collapse under all this invasion. They absorb it. Every group that lands on their shores leaves behind tools, ideas, and bloodlines. It's like a grim version of cultural fusion cuisine, and by the time the Normans come calling in 1066, England isn't just surviving, it's weirdly prepared for what comes next. Because the British, though they don't know it yet, are about to stop being invaded and start doing the invading. William the Conqueror didn't just bring an army across the Channel. He brought admin. The Normans, descendants of Viking settlers in France, were fluent in violence and paperwork. And when they crushed the English at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, they didn't just replace the king, they replaced the system. Suddenly, all the old Anglo-Saxon nobility were out, and a new French-speaking elite took over everything. Manors, courts, castles, you name it. The Domesday Book was compiled less than 20 years later. A national audit so detailed it even noted how many pigs a village had. It was, in many ways, the birth of state-level paranoia. And it worked. England became one of the most tightly governed kingdoms in Europe. But the Normans weren't content with just ruling England. They had itchy feet. Within decades they were slicing into Wales, nudging into Scotland, and conquering huge swaths of Ireland. To be clear, Ireland had never done anything to provoke England other than exist nearby. But that was enough. Anglo-Norman lords started carving it up with swords and charters, setting a pattern that would repeat for centuries. And here's a quirky little tidbit. Some of those Anglo-Norman settlers in Ireland went so native, they ended up being described as more Irish than the Irish themselves. By the 14th century, England had lost control of most of Ireland again, except for a strip of land around Dublin, known as the Pale. Yes, that's where we get the phrase beyond the pale. Still, the English crown was learning something critical. Conquest wasn't just about battles, it was about institutions. Castles, sheriffs, taxes, and laws. You don't just take land, you wrap it in red tape until it can't breathe without your permission. Back in England, things were getting spicy. The Plantagenet dynasty rose to power in the 12th century, and with it came empire dreams. But not overseas. No, their eyes were fixed firmly on France. Through a series of dynastic marriages, and one extremely ambitious woman named Eleanor of Aquitaine, the English crown ended up ruling nearly half of France. For a while, it didn't last. The Norman boot camp begins. The year was 1066, and England was about to change forever. It started with a battle on a hill outside Hastings, where a fleet of Norman ships crossed the Channel, carrying not just warriors but a new way of thinking about power, centralized, organized, ruthless. William, Duke of Normandy, who would soon earn the nickname the Conqueror, was no ordinary invader. He was a master planner, a tax collector, and an architect of medieval bureaucracy. His victory wasn't just military, it was administrative. Before William's arrival, England was a patchwork quilt of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, local lords, and often chaotic feuds. The old nobility ran their estates more like semi-independent states. Laws varied from county to county, and royal authority was patchy at best. The Normans brought order, but it came with a price. castles everywhere, tighter royal control, and a new French-speaking elite that reshaped England's culture and politics for centuries. William's first task after Hastings was to secure his reign, which meant rewarding loyal followers with land and titles, and dispossessing Anglo-Saxon nobles. This wholesale redistribution created a new aristocracy that owed everything to the Norman king. It also meant a lot of displaced English lords, which sowed seeds of resentment and rebellion. But rebellion was costly, and thanks to the rapid construction of motte and bailey castles, easily crushed. One of the most famous legacies of this period is the Domesday Book, completed in 1086. It was essentially the world's first massive government survey, a detailed audit of landholdings, resources, and population. It read like a medieval census crossed with a tax ledger, cataloguing who owned what, who owed whom, and how much money should be collected. For the king, it was a way to squeeze the economy efficiently. For the people, it was the start of living under a very watchful eye. But the Normans didn't just stop at castles and taxes. They changed the legal system, introduced feudalism in full force, and established a centralized monarchy with sheriffs, courts, and royal writs. This system created layers of accountability that the previous Anglo-Saxon kings had struggled to enforce. England became a kingdom where the king's word mattered, at least on paper. Norman culture filtered down slowly. The nobility spoke French, while peasants continued with Old English dialects that would eventually evolve into Middle English. Churches were rebuilt in Romanesque style. Massive cathedrals replaced wooden chapels, and monastic reforms swept through the land. England, which had been a bit provincial, suddenly looked and felt connected to continental Europe in new ways. Here's a quirky detail. The English language itself was profoundly reshaped by the Normans. Over the next few centuries, tens of thousands of French words entered English vocabulary, especially around law, governance, art, and cuisine. So when you talk about justice, government, or feast, you're using words that arrived courtesy of William and his followers. The Norman conquest was a linguistic invasion as much as a military one. Historians still argue whether this rapid centralization helped create a stable state faster than most of Europe, or simply masked deep social tensions. Some see it as the foundation of England's later imperial success, because it gave kings tools to raise armies, collect taxes, and enforce laws far better than most medieval monarchs could. Others point out that it planted divisions between conquerors and conquered, laying groundwork for centuries of conflict. Across the Channel, the Normans were just as busy. William's heirs retained their ancestral lands in Normandy, and this dual identity as both English kings and French dukes created a tangled web of loyalties. Over time, this led to conflicts known as the Angevin Empire Wars, which aimed to hold vast territories across France, an ambitious but ultimately unsustainable stretch of power. So, by the time the 12th century dawned, England was no longer a sleepy island of tribes and earls. It was a kingdom under a king who demanded loyalty, organized governance, and an emerging sense of what we might now call statehood. And those changes, brutal as they could be, paved the way for England's next big imperial ambitions, because a kingdom that could command its own land with iron and law could soon dream of commanding much more. The Tudors arrived on the English throne in 1485. Emerging from the rubble of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that had drained the nobility and left the country exhausted and fractured. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, wasn't a glamorous warrior, but a shrewd accountant disguised in royal robes. His reign marked a deliberate shift from chaotic feudalism toward a more centralized, bureaucratic monarchy, a government that could project power more efficiently and plan grander ambitions. Henry VII's most important achievement wasn't a battle, but peace. He ended decades of bloodshed by marrying Elizabeth of York, uniting warring factions under the new Tudor banner. This marriage wasn't just symbolic, it was a PR move that transformed England's royal narrative. The Tudors rebranded the monarchy from fragile to formidable, from squabbling barons to divine right rulers. The Tudors were masters of image. Their reign saw a renaissance of art, culture, and architecture, laying foundations for Britain's cultural soft power that would later accompany its imperial reach. Portraits, pageantry, and propaganda were used to project an image of strength and legitimacy. Henry VIII, Henry VII's son, was the embodiment of this Tudor flamboyance, a larger-than-life king, known as much for his 6 wives as for shaking up England's relationship with the Catholic Church. Henry VIII's break with Rome was a seismic moment, both religiously and politically. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry declared himself head of the Church of England, dissolving monasteries and confiscating their vast wealth. This religious upheaval wasn't just about theology, it was a huge land grab and a power play that funneled resources into the royal coffers and allied nobility. This reformation had long-lasting consequences. It severed England from Catholic Europe, fostering a unique national identity rooted in Protestantism. England was now officially different, defiantly so, which would justify its later rivalry with Catholic powers like Spain and France. Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's daughter, perfected the Tudor brand. Her reign from 1558 to 1603 was England's coming-of-age story. Elizabeth was a political virtuoso, balancing religious factions, foreign threats, and court intrigues, with a combination of charm, wit, and steel. Under her, England became a naval power, challenging Spain's dominance and fostering exploration. Elizabeth's support for privateers, essentially pirates, with royal blessing, set the stage for empire. Figures like Sir Francis Drake raided Spanish ships and circumnavigated the globe, bringing wealth and prestige. This wasn't empire through direct conquest yet, but it was empire through audacity, sea power, and economic opportunism. The era also witnessed the beginnings of English colonization attempts. The ill-fated Roanoke colony, dubbed the Lost Colony, was England's first attempt to plant a foothold in the Americas, ending mysteriously and unsuccessfully. Despite setbacks, these ventures planted the seed of expansionist ambition. Religion and empire were intertwined. The Tudors promoted the idea that spreading Protestantism was a divine mission, giving imperialism a moral gloss. This sense of religious destiny would fuel much of Britain's later overseas ventures, justifying conquest as a civilizing act. Meanwhile, the economy began to shift. Trade expanded, not just in Europe, but across the Atlantic and beyond. The English Navy grew stronger, not just for defense, but as an instrument of global reach. The Tudors laid the groundwork for a maritime culture that would define Britain for centuries. A quirky bit from Tudor times: the potato arrived in England during Elizabeth's reign, but it wasn't widely adopted until much later. Meanwhile, tobacco, another New World import, became an instant obsession, influencing social habits and even economics. Historians still debate whether the Tudors were proto-imperialists or just lucky rulers caught up in global currents. But what's undeniable is that they transformed England into a kingdom ready for empire, a place where central authority, naval power, religious identity, and economic ambition merged. This was the Tudor boot camp for British imperialism. From the chaos of medieval England, the Tudors forged a confident, outward-looking nation, one ready to cross oceans, challenge superpowers, and begin the long, complicated story of empire, pirates, piety, and potato chips. By the late 16th century, England was still a relatively small island kingdom, but its ambitions were growing. The Tudors had laid the groundwork for empire, and now it was time to test those waters. Quite literally, this era saw a mix of religious zeal, entrepreneurial risk-taking, and seafaring boldness that started cracking open the world beyond Europe for England. One of the most defining features of this period was the rise of the sea dogs, English privateers who blurred the lines between pirates and patriots. Men like Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, and Walter Raleigh weren't just adventurers. They were agents of the Crown's expanding reach. With the blessing of Queen Elizabeth, they attacked Spanish ships loaded with gold and silver from the Americas, seizing treasure that funded England's naval growth and colonial ambitions. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, from 1577 to 1580, wasn't just a voyage, it was a statement. Sailing into uncharted waters, harrying Spanish ports, and returning laden with loot, Drake demonstrated that England could challenge Spain's hegemony on the seas. Elizabeth knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind, a symbolic endorsement of England's piracy as empire policy. Religion played a huge role in these conflicts. England was staunchly Protestant, while Spain and much of Catholic Europe saw Protestantism as heresy. This religious divide wasn't just spiritual, it was political and military. Elizabeth's England viewed Catholic Spain as the greatest threat, which justified supporting rebellions in the Spanish Netherlands and sponsoring raids against Spanish interests worldwide. This era also witnessed the infamous Spanish Armada of 1588, when Spain launched a massive fleet to invade England and restore Catholic rule. England's smaller, more maneuverable ships, combined with bad weather and strategic missteps, led to the Armada's defeat, a moment that became legendary. It wasn't just a naval victory, it was a symbolic affirmation of England's resilience and divine favor. But it wasn't all about war and conquest. New products from the Americas began arriving, changing English diets and economies. Tobacco became wildly popular, despite health warnings even back then about its addictive qualities. And sugar, initially a rare luxury, was becoming the backbone of future colonial wealth. Here's where potato chips sneak in. Well, almost. Potatoes arrived from the New World during this period, but weren't immediately embraced. They took a while to catch on, especially in England, where the upper classes were suspicious of this strange underground vegetable. The potato's rise to staple status would happen later, but its arrival marked the beginning of global food exchanges that reshaped societies. Religious piety and imperial ambition fed off each other. Missionaries started envisioning a world united under Protestantism, a spiritual empire that mirrored England's earthly one. This mix of zeal and greed set the tone for future colonization, spreading the faith while chasing profit. English privateering blurred moral lines, but it was effective. The wealth generated fueled shipbuilding, navigation advances, and the nascent British Navy. It also spread English influence from the Caribbean to the coasts of Africa and North America. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth's support of piracy was statecraft or sheer opportunism. Either way, it signaled a new way England would project power: indirect, pragmatic, and unapologetically aggressive. So, by the end of the 16th century, England had started to punch above its weight. It was no longer content to be a European backwater. Instead, it was an emerging maritime power, blending religion, piracy, and trade into a cocktail that would soon fuel an empire. From stolen gold to sugar plantations, from prayers to gunpowder, this period set the stage for a British presence that would stretch around the globe. East India Company, World Domination Inc. At the dawn of the 17th century, the British Empire took a curious turn. It became corporate. On the very last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants, giving birth to the Honourable East India Company. At first glance, it was just a trading enterprise aiming to break into the lucrative spice trade dominated by the Portuguese and Dutch. But beneath the modest title, a powerful and dangerous force was born, one that would transform into a private empire so vast it would dominate half a continent. Initially, the company's fortunes were shaky at best. The Dutch East India Company was already established, fiercely defending its trading monopolies across Southeast Asia. Portugal held fortified bases from Africa to the Spice Islands. English merchants, eager but inexperienced, had to find an alternative route into the market. They quickly pivoted away from the Spice Islands and toward the Indian subcontinent, trading wool and silver for textiles, spices, and precious stones. The early days were a mix of diplomacy, bribery, and luck. The company set up trading posts, or factories, along India's coastline. Places like Surat, Madras, and Bombay, now Mumbai, each guarded by hired mercenaries, who kept a wary eye on local rulers and rival traders. These factories weren't manufacturing plants as we think of today, but rather fortified warehouses, part trade hub, part mini-fortress, from which company officials slowly built relationships and quietly gathered intelligence. But things escalated quickly. By the early 1700s, the once humble merchants had amassed private armies of their own, filled mostly with Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, trained and commanded by British officers. The company's ambitions weren't limited to trade. They increasingly interfered in local politics. backing princes who were friendly and undermining those who resisted their influence. It was imperialism by balance sheet, colonialism as a corporate strategy. The critical turning point was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive, a company clerk turned general, bribed a rival general and crushed the forces of Bengal's ruler. Overnight, the company gained control over one of India's richest regions. Bengal was fertile, wealthy, and strategically vital. It quickly became the company's base of operations, turning immense profits through taxation, monopolies, and ruthless exploitation. Yet beneath the economic windfall lay tragedy. In 1770, Bengal suffered a catastrophic famine, caused partly by drought but worsened significantly by the company's tax policies and grain exports. Nearly a third of Bengal's population, millions of people, died from starvation, while company officials continued exporting grain and collecting taxes as usual. It was a grim illustration of the brutal reality beneath Britain's imperial gloss. Back in London, few questioned the morality. The profits flowing from Bengal made the East India Company rich beyond imagining. It bought political influence, funded lavish estates, and reshaped the city of London itself. Leadenhall Street, home to the company's headquarters, became synonymous with power, wealth, and ambition. Parliament, benefiting from company profits, looked the other way, even as critics began raising questions about corporate morality and imperial ethics. At its height, the East India Company commanded an army of over 250,000 men, larger than many European states. It printed its own currency, ran its own courts, and made its own laws. A private company governed nearly 200 million people. The idea seems absurd today, but at the time, it was simply good business. But business, as it turned out, had limits. Corruption scandals and mismanagement eventually forced the British government to intervene. The Regulating Act of 1773 marked the first step in transforming the company from a rogue trading enterprise into a colonial administration, overseen at least theoretically by Parliament. Still, the company held power, maintaining its monopolies and profits well into the 19th century. A quirky footnote: the company popularized tea drinking in Britain. Tea, originally from China, became a national obsession, shaping British habits forever. Yet tea brought problems too. Specifically, a massive trade deficit with China. The solution: selling opium, grown in India, to Chinese markets, triggering conflicts that would later become the infamous Opium Wars. Historians still debate whether the East India Company's rule was an accidental empire or deliberate strategy. Some argue it stumbled into empire building through opportunism and greed. Others see deliberate calculation, highlighting its systematic exploitation and ruthless efficiency. Either way, the company's legacy was profound. Its methods, economic manipulation, political intrigue, military force, set the pattern for British imperial rule worldwide. Its collapse after the Indian Rebellion of 1857 would mark a shift from corporate to crown control. But its shadow remains, a stark reminder of the brutal economics behind imperialism. This wasn't empire through noble conquest. It was empire as boardroom policy, corporate profit, and unchecked ambition. And Britain, having tasted such power and wealth, was only beginning to expand. In 1707, England and Scotland, two ancient rivals separated by centuries of bloodshed, grudgingly merged into a single kingdom. Great Britain, it wasn't exactly a love match. Scotland, financially drained after a failed attempt at overseas colonization, known as the disastrous Darien Scheme, saw union as economic survival. England viewed it strategically as a way to secure the northern border and expand markets. The result was a shotgun marriage that profoundly reshaped Britain's imperial ambitions. With Scotland on board, Great Britain gained not just territory but talent. Scottish intellectuals, soldiers, engineers and merchants soon filled the ranks of British institutions. Glasgow and Edinburgh became booming centres of trade, fueling Britain's emerging industrial might. Scots, previously outsiders in imperial circles, quickly became empire builders themselves, forging legacies across the Americas, Asia and Africa. But perhaps more important than people or resources was symbolism. The newly designed Union Jack combined the English cross of St. George with the Scottish saltire of St. Andrew, creating an iconic emblem that would soon fly across the globe. Flags matter in empire. They brand power, declare presence, and reinforce authority. The Union Jack was Britain's calling card, signaling global ambitions and national unity, even if internal tensions persisted. One key to British dominance was its navy. By the mid-1700s, the Royal Navy had evolved from a defensive force into an unparalleled maritime juggernaut. British warships patrolled global trade routes, securing colonies, intimidating rivals, and projecting power far beyond their shores. This naval supremacy allowed Britain not only to protect its existing colonies, but also to expand aggressively, carving out new territories with relative ease. The Caribbean islands became immensely valuable possessions, driven by sugar plantations that depended on enslaved labor from Africa. Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands were transformed into brutal but profitable colonies. Sugar, once a luxury item, became affordable in Britain, fueling tea-drinking habits and enriching traders and landowners at horrific human cost. This era also saw Britain expand into North America with renewed enthusiasm. By the mid-1700s, British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast from Canada down to Georgia. Colonial populations swelled with migrants from Britain and enslaved Africans forcibly brought across the ocean. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston became centers of trade, culture, and rebellion. A quirky historical detail emerged here. Benjamin Franklin's famous experiment with electricity in Philadelphia during the 1750s wasn't just scientific curiosity. It symbolized the growing confidence and intellectual independence of Britain's colonies. Hinting at future conflicts, America was starting to see itself less as a colonial outpost and more as a distinct entity, a mindset that would soon lead to trouble. But before rebellion exploded, the 7 Years' War 1756–1763, arguably the first truly global war, reshaped Britain's empire dramatically. Britain and France fought fiercely across North America, India, the Caribbean, Europe, and even West Africa. British victory was decisive, gaining them Canada from France, control over India's Bengal region, and expanded territories worldwide. But victory brought crippling debts, prompting Britain to tax American colonies heavily to cover the costs. These taxes, like the infamous Stamp Act, sparked resentment that would eventually ignite revolution. Meanwhile, in India, Britain's presence evolved dramatically after this war. The East India Company's victory at Plassey in 1757 solidified its grip on Bengal, transforming the company into a political powerhouse rather than mere merchants. Britain now wielded unprecedented influence over Indian rulers, effectively colonizing vast regions through a corporation. This corporate colonization became the blueprint for imperial expansion elsewhere. Historians still debate whether this period of union and aggressive expansion was Britain's golden age of empire, or the beginning of an unsustainable overstretch. Either way, it marked a clear turning point. Britain wasn't just a European power anymore, it was a global empire in the making. But expansion brought challenges. Integrating diverse territories required managing populations with vastly different cultures, religions, and expectations. Tensions simmered within the empire, between colonizers and colonized, settlers and indigenous peoples, enslavers and enslaved. These internal contradictions would only deepen, setting the stage for future conflicts and eventual collapse. Despite these cracks, Britain's imperial project appeared unstoppable. The Union Jack flew from forts in India to plantations in Jamaica, from Canadian trading posts to African slave ports. The British identity itself was changing, becoming inseparable from empire. Wealth, pride, and power flowed from distant colonies, reshaping British society fundamentally. By the late 1700s, Britain stood poised on the brink of unprecedented dominance. Its navy ruled the seas. Its economy profited enormously from slavery and colonial trade, and its culture spread far and wide. But this golden era of empire building contained seeds of future turmoil. The colonies Britain now controlled, rich, distant, and increasingly restless, would not stay silent forever. Great Britain had successfully united its island, but managing an empire scattered across oceans and continents was an entirely different challenge. Beneath the glory and triumph lay tensions that would soon fracture the very foundations of empire. By the mid-1700s, Britain's empire had become a global economic machine, powered largely by one brutal commodity: sugar. Sugar plantations, primarily in the Caribbean islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua, generated immense wealth, but at an extraordinary human cost. This sweet luxury became the lifeblood of Britain's economic system, driving profits, shaping trade routes, and forever transforming the Atlantic world. The Caribbean islands were the crown jewels of Britain's economic empire, each island a factory of immense productivity, but the plantations were powered by enslaved Africans, forced into brutal labor conditions under the scorching sun. Captives were taken from West Africa, chained and packed aboard British ships, and transported across the infamous Middle Passage. The journey was horrific, marked by disease, starvation, and unimaginable cruelty. Millions died en route or soon after arriving in the colonies, and those who survived faced lives of relentless exploitation. This triangular trade defined the era's economy. British ships left ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London, loaded with goods, textiles, guns, rum, to exchange for enslaved Africans in West Africa. They transported these captives to the Caribbean and American colonies, selling them into slavery to work plantations. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other products produced by enslaved labor then returned to Britain, completing the profitable triangle. It was an economic system built entirely on human misery, yet it fueled Britain's imperial growth, creating vast fortunes and building entire cities. Britain wasn't alone in this trade. Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands were heavily involved. But Britain became especially efficient. Slave trading was highly organized, regulated, and incentivized by British investors and merchants. Even everyday Britons benefited indirectly, consuming sugar in tea, cakes, and sweets, often unaware or willfully ignorant of the suffering behind their daily comforts. A strange irony emerged. Britain, which prided itself on liberty, was building global dominance on slavery. Enlightenment ideals of freedom and human dignity flourished simultaneously with brutal exploitation in colonies overseas. Philosophers like John Locke wrote passionately about liberty, yet many justified slavery through twisted logic, calling it necessary for economic progress, or even arguing it benefited enslaved people by introducing them to civilization. Yet even within this hypocrisy, a growing anti-slavery movement began emerging in Britain. Quakers and other religious groups first condemned slavery on moral grounds, eventually joined by abolitionists like William Wilberforce. Pamphlets, meetings, and petitions gradually raised awareness, although actual change came slowly. The vast economic interests built on slavery resisted fiercely, blocking attempts at reform. Meanwhile, sugar transformed Britain socially and economically. Sugar consumption exploded, becoming essential to British diets across all social classes. Tea and coffee became staples, sweetened by cheap Caribbean sugar. Sugar was addictive, profitable, and transformative, fueling the growth of cafes, confectionaries, and refined dining habits. Sugar even influenced British dentistry, creating the first boom in tooth decay and inspiring early dental practices. Britain's empire reshaped not just economics, but everyday life itself. Sugar wealth also reshaped Britain's cities. Ports like Liverpool and Bristol grew rich, their streets lined with merchants' mansions, banks, insurance companies, and warehouses financed by slavery profits. Britain's economic infrastructure, banking, insurance, shipping, was deeply intertwined with slavery and colonial trade. Many major British corporations today trace their roots back to slave-related investments, though this history is often quietly obscured. In the colonies, resistance emerged despite harsh punishments. Enslaved people regularly rebelled, sabotaged work, or escaped into the wilderness. The Maroons of Jamaica formed independent communities, fiercely resisting British attempts to re-enslave them. Slave rebellions terrified planters, who responded with ever harsher laws, attempting to crush resistance through violence and terror. But rebellions persisted, reminding Britain that enslaved people never passively accepted their condition. Historians still debate Britain's role in slavery, questioning whether economic necessity drove it or whether ideological racism justified exploitation. The uncomfortable truth lies somewhere in between. Britain profited enormously from slavery while simultaneously grappling with its moral contradictions. This tension between profit and morality defined Britain's imperial identity, shaping future conflicts over abolition, colonialism, and racism. The triangular trade eventually weakened, driven partly by abolitionist pressure, partly by economic shifts, and partly by the growing realization that slavery was unsustainable both morally and practically. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself across the empire in 1833, paying huge sums to compensate slave owners, but giving nothing to enslaved people themselves. Even in abolition, economic interests took priority. Yet abolition did not erase slavery's legacy. The economic foundations built on enslaved labor endured, shaping Britain's financial systems and global influence long afterward. Colonies suffered lasting consequences, facing economic underdevelopment, racial inequalities, and social conflicts rooted in slavery's violent past. Sugar, slavery, and the triangular trade marked Britain's empire profoundly. This brutal system generated enormous wealth, fueling Britain's rise to global dominance, while simultaneously embedding deep contradictions into British identity itself. Britain's empire thrived on sweetness and cruelty, liberty and bondage, progress and suffering. These contradictions, unresolved and uncomfortable, remain central to understanding Britain's imperial legacy. By the late 18th century, the British Empire had transformed into a military colossus. Wherever the Union Jack flew, the red-coated British soldier became a symbol of order or oppression, depending on your perspective. These soldiers, called redcoats for their bright uniforms, were the empire's muscle, enforcing British rule from American forests to Indian palaces, from African forts to Australian outposts. Britain's global ambitions depended on military might, turning the small island nation into a sprawling martial empire, unlike any before it. Redcoats weren't merely soldiers. They embodied Britain's authority worldwide. They were drawn from every corner of Britain, often young men who enlisted out of poverty, boredom, or sheer adventure-seeking. Army life was brutal, discipline harsh, and living conditions often miserable. But service promised steady pay, rations and perhaps glory. Soldiers traveled immense distances by sailing ships, enduring months-long journeys to remote colonies, where disease and combat took staggering tolls. The army became a unique colonial melting pot. Scottish Highland regiments, Irish infantrymen, and English officers served together, often speaking different dialects or languages altogether. Military culture enforced strict hierarchy, but also fostered camaraderie and identity. Soldiers developed shared experiences and rituals that reinforced loyalty not just to Britain, but to each other, creating powerful bonds within regiments. Britain's military strategy relied heavily on discipline and firepower. Infantry trained tirelessly in formations, volley fire, and bayonet charges, tactics designed to crush enemies swiftly and decisively. Battles like Plassey in India, Saratoga in America, or Waterloo in Belgium highlighted British discipline, bravery, and sometimes stubborn arrogance. Though the British didn't always win, their ability to project power far beyond their shores amazed and terrified the world. Yet British armies didn't fight alone. They relied heavily on local troops, such as Indian sepoys, African auxiliaries, and indigenous allies across the Americas. This reliance was strategic. Local troops knew terrain, languages, and cultures better than British soldiers. But it also created vulnerabilities. Local troops sometimes rebelled, as in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, highlighting the precariousness of British control and revealing deep tensions underlying imperial authority. One famous imperial defeat came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia, where American rebels, aided by French forces, defeated British troops decisively, ending Britain's attempt to crush the American Revolution. This defeat wasn't just military, it was symbolic, exposing Britain's limits and encouraging rebellion elsewhere. Yet remarkably, Losing America didn't end Britain's imperial ambitions, it intensified them. After America, Britain expanded aggressively into Canada, Australia, Africa, and Asia, determined not to repeat past mistakes. In India, redcoats symbolized authority and fear. British officers imposed harsh discipline on Indian sepoys, sometimes sparking violent mutinies. Yet British rule persisted, propped up by ruthless suppression and clever diplomacy. Battles like the Siege of Seringapatam against Tipu Sultan showcased Britain's willingness to use overwhelming force, securing dominance at brutal cost. Africa, too, felt Britain's military might. British forces occupied Cape Colony in 1795, securing vital sea routes to India. African fortresses guarded trade in enslaved people and ivory, while British troops fought bitter wars against indigenous groups resisting encroachment. Redcoats became infamous in Africa for harsh tactics, burning villages, and forcibly resettling communities. Yet African resistance persisted fiercely, frustrating British efforts to impose complete dominance. Quirky historical note: the British Army's iconic red coats weren't purely aesthetic. They initially hid bloodstains, reducing panic among troops during battle. Later, bright red became impractical as warfare evolved, but the image endured, becoming symbolic rather than functional. Historians still debate whether British military strength was primarily due to disciplined training or ruthless tactics. Some argue Britain's dominance arose from tactical brilliance. Others highlight brutality and sheer force. What's undeniable is that military power underpinned the empire, allowing Britain to maintain vast territories despite logistical nightmares and cultural challenges. But military might had consequences. Maintaining global forces drained Britain's treasury and strained social fabric at home. Soldiers returned physically broken and mentally scarred, struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Families mourned loved ones buried overseas, far from home. War heroes sometimes returned to poverty, abandoned by a society quick to celebrate victories, but slower to support survivors. Moreover, military expansion bred resentment worldwide. Colonized peoples experienced British rule as violent oppression, enforced by bayonets and cannonballs. Rebellions and resistance became common, fueled by anger at occupation and mistreatment. Britain's military presence, intended to secure empire, often undermined it, sparking revolts that eventually weakened British authority. Yet Britain pressed onward. Its military machine churned out victories, defeats, heroes, and tragedies across every continent. Soldiers patrolled distant jungles, deserts, mountains, and cities, enforcing British law or the red coat uniform became simultaneously iconic and despised, symbolizing both order and tyranny. By the 19th century, Britain's global military presence was unmatched, marking every continent, every time zone, and every ocean. Yet beneath this powerful image lay deep contradictions. Soldiers celebrated as heroes, but often treated as expendable. Victories praised publicly, but privately, costly. Britain's military might secured an empire vast and ambitious, yet fundamentally fragile, vulnerable to internal tensions and external challenges. Ultimately, the redcoat's image endures as a complicated symbol: strength and oppression, pride and shame, courage and cruelty. Britain's military legacy, embodied by its red-coated soldiers, remains a potent reminder of empire's complex realities, its costs, contradictions, and enduring impacts around the world. In 1776, Britain's empire suffered a blow that shook it to the core. 13 colonies along North America's Atlantic coast declared independence, challenging British authority and triggering a war that would redefine Britain's imperial ambitions. This rebellion wasn't just military, it was ideological. American colonists rejected British taxation without representation, asserting their right to govern themselves. Their defiance exposed deep cracks within the British Empire, questioning its legitimacy and effectiveness. At first, Britain underestimated the revolution. It saw colonists as unruly subjects who'd soon submit. But the American Revolution rapidly escalated, dragging Britain into a brutal conflict fought across the colonies. From Boston's harbor to southern swamps, British troops faced guerrilla warfare, supply shortages, and local hostility. Far from home, fighting against determined rebels, the British struggled with logistics, morale, and strategy. Ironically, Britain's army was superior on paper, better trained, better equipped, but they fought far from supply bases, in unfamiliar terrain facing a population increasingly hostile. British commanders frequently misunderstood American motivations, assuming colonists were easily cowed or bribed. But American rebels weren't just fighting for lower taxes, they fought for liberty, identity, and dignity. Britain's misunderstanding of colonial grievances doomed their efforts from the start. The war's turning point came at Saratoga in 1777, when British forces suffered a devastating defeat, persuading France to support America openly. French involvement transformed the conflict into a global war, stretching British resources thin. Battles erupted worldwide, from Caribbean islands to Indian seas, forcing Britain to defend multiple fronts simultaneously, weakening its ability to crush American rebels decisively. In 1781, the British Army faced humiliating defeat at Yorktown, Virginia, surrounded by American rebels and French troops. Britain surrendered thousands of soldiers, effectively ending major fighting. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized American independence. Britain had lost its prized colonies, shaking imperial confidence profoundly. Losing America felt catastrophic, a humiliating defeat for Britain's global reputation. Yet paradoxically, losing America didn't cripple Britain, it strengthened its imperial resolve. British elites, shaken by defeat, didn't abandon imperial ambitions, they intensified them. They reasoned America's loss, highlighted mistakes to avoid elsewhere. Britain learned from American rebellion, resolving to rule remaining colonies with greater control, tighter discipline, and smarter diplomacy. Britain swiftly turned attention elsewhere, particularly Canada, India, and the Caribbean. In Canada, loyalists fleeing America after independence bolstered British colonies, reinforcing loyalty and stability. Britain invested heavily in Canada, determined to avoid repeating American mistakes. Meanwhile, Caribbean sugar islands remained immensely profitable, sustained by slavery and secured by naval dominance. Britain's grip tightened, determined not to lose further ground. India became even more critical. Britain had long controlled India, indirectly through the East India Company, profiting immensely from trade and taxation. After America's loss, India's strategic value soared. Britain poured resources into fortifying Indian positions, expanding military presence, and tightening political control. Losing America ironically increased India's importance, transforming it from profitable colony to imperial jewel. British naval power expanded aggressively. Losing American ports highlighted Britain's reliance on naval supremacy. The Royal Navy dominated sea routes, protecting colonies, trade, and global influence. Britain captured strategic bases worldwide: Gibraltar, Malta, Caribbean islands, creating fortified naval hubs essential for empire building. Britain's navy projected global power, reminding rivals Britain remained formidable despite setbacks. At home, losing America sparked intense debate. Politicians argued fiercely about imperial strategy, questioning whether Britain should expand cautiously or aggressively. Reformers challenged colonial policies, demanding changes to avoid future rebellions. Economically, Britain shifted attention toward trade with Asia and Africa, seeking compensation for lost American markets. Meanwhile, losing America fueled British nationalism. Public outrage, embarrassment, and resentment blended into fierce patriotism. Literature, propaganda, and political rhetoric emphasized Britain's strength, despite setbacks. Losing colonies made British elites defensive, determined to restore imperial prestige swiftly. Historians still debate whether losing America strengthened or weakened Britain. Long term, some argue it spurred smarter policies, forcing Britain to rethink colonial strategies. Others believe it weakened imperial authority irreparably, encouraging rebellions elsewhere. But most agree Britain emerged surprisingly resilient, quickly pivoting toward new imperial ambitions worldwide. A quirky historical fact: Britain retained control of Canada after the American Revolution, partly because French-speaking Canadians feared joining the rebellious Americans, preferring familiar British authority. British diplomacy exploited these cultural divisions, maintaining Canadian loyalty, illustrating Britain's ability to manipulate colonial tensions strategically. Ultimately, losing America paradoxically increased Britain's global ambitions. Britain refocused aggressively on Asia, Africa, Canada, and the Caribbean. Determined to rebuild empire stronger than before, defeat didn't destroy British confidence, it sharpened it, forcing Britain to refine imperial strategies, strengthen military capabilities, and tighten control over remaining colonies. Britain lost America, but emerged more determined, resourceful and resilient, ready to build an even bigger empire, stretching across continents and oceans. Losing America wasn't empire's end, it was empire's pivot, marking a new era of intensified imperial ambition, confidence, and power projection worldwide. In the early 19th century, Britain faced a tricky economic problem. It had become completely hooked on tea. British society had developed an obsession with this fragrant leaf from China. Tea wasn't merely a beverage, it was a cultural institution. The demand was insatiable, yet Britain's trading relationship with China was massively imbalanced. China had little interest in British goods, accepting only silver in return for their precious tea leaves. This imbalance drained Britain's coffers, forcing them to seek an alternative and morally dubious solution. Opium, derived from poppies, had long been used medicinally in China, but Britain turned it into a commercial weapon. The British East India Company began cultivating vast fields of opium poppies in Bengal, then shipping the drug to Chinese ports, illegally flooding the Chinese market. Demand surged as addiction spread among millions of Chinese, creating widespread social problems and increasing Britain's profits dramatically. What began as an economic fix for Britain's tea habit soon transformed into ruthless exploitation, with devastating human consequences. Chinese authorities were horrified. The opium crisis destabilized society, leading to addiction, poverty, and crime. The Qing dynasty attempted to halt opium imports, imposing strict bans, seizing British shipments, and arresting smugglers. In 1839, the Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu famously confiscated and destroyed 20,000 chests of British opium at Canton, openly defying Britain's illicit trade. Britain responded not with negotiation, but with war. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, became Britain's method of forcing trade by violence. British gunboats and troops attacked coastal cities, easily overwhelming Chinese forces, armed mainly with outdated weaponry. The war exposed China's military vulnerability and Britain's ruthless determination to maintain opium profits at any cost. Chinese cities fell swiftly, humiliation deepened, and the Qing government ultimately surrendered. In 1842, China signed the Treaty of Nanking, one of history's infamous unequal treaties. China was forced to cede Hong Kong to Britain, pay massive reparations, open additional ports to British trade, and grant special legal privileges to British citizens in China, known as extraterritoriality. This treaty was economic colonization disguised as diplomacy, humiliating China and ensuring Britain's dominance in Asian trade. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, further intensified Britain's control. Britain, joined by France, again defeated China, imposing harsher terms, expanding trading privileges, and legalizing the opium trade entirely. British and French troops looted Beijing, famously burning the magnificent Summer Palace, an act intended not just to punish, but to humiliate China permanently. Britain viewed these wars not as aggression, but as justified responses protecting trade interests, a disturbing rationalization that shaped imperial policy worldwide. Hong Kong became Britain's crucial Asian outpost, transforming from a tiny fishing village into a bustling port city, symbolizing British power, ambition, and arrogance. Hong Kong's wealth exploded, fueled by trade in tea, silk, spices, and of course opium. Yet beneath glittering prosperity lay deep inequality. Opium dens flourished, addiction spread, and poverty afflicted the local population, showcasing imperialism's dark underbelly. Ironically, opium wars originated Britain's global anti-drug crusades later. Having imposed opium addiction on China, Britain later led international efforts to control drugs. This hypocrisy highlighted empire's contradictions, imposing suffering abroad, then moralizing against it later. Britain's moral justifications for empire, civilization, progress, law, collapsed starkly beneath opium's harsh realities. Historians still debate Britain's opium wars, questioning whether economics or racism drove policies more strongly. Some argue Britain acted pragmatically to correct trade imbalances. Others emphasize racial contempt toward China, depicting Chinese as inferior, needing British discipline. Either way, opium wars remain among empire's darkest chapters. Violent, exploitative, and profoundly hypocritical. Meanwhile, Britain internally debated opium ethics. Missionaries and reformers condemned opium's destructive effects, pressuring Britain to reconsider policies. Public opinion gradually turned against opium profits, recognizing Britain's moral hypocrisy. Yet, economic interests resisted fiercely, defending opium profits vehemently. Empire revealed stark contradictions: wealth versus morality, profit versus principle. A quirky historical detail: Britain's obsession with tea ironically stemmed from China, but later Britain introduced tea cultivation into India, stealing Chinese tea plants, smuggling them into Assam, and establishing lucrative tea plantations. Britain thus transformed tea from Chinese monopoly into imperial asset, shifting economic power from China toward India. Britain's colony highlighting imperial exploitation vividly. Britain's opium diplomacy and tea obsession showcased imperialism's ruthless pragmatism, forcing trade violently, addicting populations deliberately, exploiting vulnerabilities callously. Britain's empire thrived economically, but morally collapsed beneath opium's weight. Tea drinking symbolized civilization, yet relied on violent exploitation abroad, starkly illustrating empire's contradictions. Ultimately, opium diplomacy deepened imperial arrogance, assuming Britain could impose trade violently, dominate societies ruthlessly, exploit addiction profitably. Yet it also intensified resistance. Chinese nationalism surged powerfully, eventually expelling foreign domination, reclaiming dignity painfully. Opium wars humiliated China temporarily, but strengthened national resolve ultimately. Britain's tea obsession sparked global conflict. Violent wars, brutal exploitation, ruthless hypocrisy. Empire thrived economically, yet collapsed morally, revealing imperialism's harsh realities. Civilization built brutally, progress rooted violently, wealth accumulated ruthlessly. Britain's imperial tea obsession remains a potent symbol: civilization masking violence, wealth masking exploitation, tea masking opium's bitter truths beneath empire's sweet facade. By the mid-19th century, India had become Britain's most precious possession, a vast land of unimaginable wealth, complex cultures and deep traditions that the British were determined to control. But beneath its glittering surface, the jewel of the British Empire was also a furnace of exploitation and resentment, slowly building towards an inevitable explosion. India's colonization had begun through trade and manipulation. The British East India Company, originally a trading enterprise, had grown into a massive corporate empire, ruling vast territories and millions of people through a mix of diplomacy, bribery, and military might. But this corporate rule was neither gentle nor enlightened. Driven purely by profit, the company ruthlessly exploited India's resources: cotton, spices, tea, silk, funneling immense wealth back to Britain, while leaving Indians impoverished and powerless. This economic exploitation intensified India's vulnerability to disasters. Famine swept through India with devastating regularity, exacerbated by British economic policies. The Bengal famine of 1770 had killed millions, but the British response was chillingly indifferent. Taxes continued, food was exported, and the company prioritized profits over lives. Such famines were frequent, yet colonial officials often blamed natural causes, ignoring their own role in worsening suffering. Politically, British rule was built on cunning strategy. The company skillfully played Indian rulers against one another, exploiting internal divisions, rivalries, and disputes to strengthen their own grip. Divide and rule became Britain's signature strategy, weakening Indian unity and making resistance difficult. Local princes retained some power, but always under British supervision, ensuring loyalty, or at least compliance. Yet beneath this oppressive system, discontent simmered. Indians resented British arrogance, racism, and exploitation. British officials imposed harsh taxes, restricted freedoms, and openly demeaned Indian culture, religion, and traditions. Disrespectful treatment by British officers deeply wounded Indian dignity, creating widespread bitterness. Resentment simmered quietly for decades, awaiting only a spark to ignite. In 1857, that spark arrived. The Indian Rebellion, also called the Sepoy Mutiny, or First War of Independence, exploded across northern India. The rebellion began among sepoys, Indian soldiers in the company's army, angered by rumors that rifle cartridges were greased with animal fat, offending Hindu and Muslim religious sensitivities. But deeper resentments quickly surfaced, turning the uprising into a mass rebellion against British rule. The rebellion shocked Britain, shattering assumptions of control. British families were massacred, forts fell, and entire cities briefly slipped from colonial control. British forces responded savagely, executing rebels brutally, burning villages, and punishing civilians mercilessly. Both sides committed atrocities, leaving deep scars on India's society and psyche. The rebellion ultimately failed militarily, crushed with overwhelming force, but it profoundly reshaped Britain's rule. The British government, horrified by violence and chaos, dissolved the East India Company in 1858. India now came under direct control of the British Crown, inaugurating the British Raj, a more formal, centralized colonial regime, promising stability, fairness, and enlightened governance. Queen Victoria famously proclaimed herself India's empress, declaring a new era of imperial benevolence and duty. But this promise of enlightened rule was deceptive. The Raj built infrastructure, railways, roads, telegraphs, but primarily to serve British interests, extracting resources more efficiently, moving troops swiftly, and consolidating control tightly. Railways, often praised as symbols of imperial progress, actually served economic exploitation, moving Indian raw materials to ports, not feeding starving people during famines. Culturally, British rule intensified racial divisions. British officials lived isolated in exclusive communities, separated from Indians by strict racial boundaries. Clubs, restaurants, and neighborhoods excluded Indians, reinforcing racial hierarchies deeply humiliating to Indians. Education systems trained Indians as clerks and servants, not leaders or equals. British superiority became official policy, provoking further resentment. Yet ironically, colonial education produced unintended consequences. English education exposed Indians to Western political ideals, liberty, democracy, nationalism, sparking intellectual awakenings. Indian elites studied British thinkers, absorbing revolutionary ideas Britain never intended to promote. Universities, newspapers, and political movements emerged demanding freedom, equality, and self-rule. Resistance grew increasingly sophisticated. Indian intellectuals formed organizations like the Indian National Congress, advocating peaceful reforms initially, but later radicalizing demands. Leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji criticized British economic exploitation fiercely, demanding fair representation and respect. Radical nationalists emerged, advocating rebellion and confrontation, inspired by Western revolutionary ideals. A quirky historical detail: British officials promoted cricket enthusiastically across India, hoping the game would instill discipline and loyalty. Ironically, cricket became deeply beloved, but also a symbol of national pride, with Indian teams eventually beating Britain decisively, turning cricket into a subtle form of resistance and pride. Historians still debate Britain's Indian rule fiercely. Some argue Britain modernized India beneficially, building infrastructure, institutions, and stability. Others emphasize brutal exploitation, racism, and destructive consequences, criticizing colonial abuses harshly. But most agree, India's colonization profoundly reshaped its future. For good and ill, leaving lasting impacts still visible today. Ultimately, Britain's jewel was also its powder keg. Decades of exploitation, racism, arrogance, and injustice inevitably sparked rebellion, nationalism, and independence struggles. Britain's empire, built on violence and exploitation, generated its own destruction, eventually. India's struggle for freedom became powerful inspiration worldwide, encouraging anti-colonial movements elsewhere, hastening global decolonization dramatically. Britain ruled India violently, exploited it ruthlessly, yet paradoxically inspired revolutionary ideas, eventually destroying empire itself. India's painful colonial legacy endures profoundly, yet resistance, resilience, and dignity emerged powerfully too, reclaiming freedom, identity, and pride painfully, but passionately. Empire created profound contradictions, wealth and poverty, progress and suffering, arrogance and humiliation, shaping Britain's legacy complexly, painfully, and powerfully. India's colonization symbolizes empire's deepest truths: civilization masking brutality, wealth masking exploitation, pride masking shame. By the late 19th century, Europe's imperial powers turned their hungry eyes towards Africa. This period, infamously called the Scramble for Africa, saw European nations carving up an entire continent, driven by greed, ambition, rivalry, and a deep sense of racial superiority. Britain, already a global empire, jumped into this scramble eagerly, determined not to miss out on what it saw as Africa's vast wealth and potential. Before the scramble, Europe's foothold in Africa had been limited mostly to coastal trading posts and isolated colonies. But the late 1800s brought new technology: steamboats, machine guns, quinine for malaria, which made deeper penetration into Africa possible. The continent, rich in minerals, agriculture, and labor, became irresistible for European powers. Britain raced aggressively against France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal, each competing furiously for control. The Berlin Conference of 1885 symbolized this ruthless European division. European leaders gathered, notably without any African representatives, to divide Africa's land, ignoring existing cultures, kingdoms, and ethnic boundaries entirely. Boundaries drawn arbitrarily by European politicians, sliced through communities, forcing diverse peoples together while separating others, creating profound tensions and conflicts still visible today. Britain emerged from this scramble as Africa's largest colonial ruler. British territories sprawled across the continent, from Egypt and Sudan in the north, Nigeria and Ghana in the west, to Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, and South Africa. Each colony promised immense wealth: gold, diamonds, ivory, rubber, cocoa, and palm oil, while strategic locations like the Suez Canal provided essential routes to India and Asia. Egypt, occupied by Britain in 1882, became particularly crucial. The Suez Canal dramatically shortened sea voyages to India and Asia, making Egypt a vital strategic hub. Britain justified occupation as protecting European financial interests after Egypt's bankruptcy, but in reality, Britain sought to secure dominance over the canal, reinforcing imperial control over Asian trade routes. Yet British control over Egypt deepened resentment fiercely. Egyptian nationalists resisted occupation passionately, sparking rebellions and nationalist movements demanding independence. Britain's heavy-handed rule inflamed tensions, turning Egypt into a colonial flashpoint for decades, illustrating empire's brutal contradictions starkly. In South Africa, British imperialism clashed violently with Boer settlers, Dutch-descended farmers resisting British domination. The Boer Wars 1899–1902 became infamous for Britain's ruthless tactics, including scorched earth policies and concentration camps imprisoning Boer civilians. Thousands died from disease and starvation in these camps, shocking British public opinion deeply, exposing imperial brutality disturbingly. Yet South Africa also exemplified empire's racial hierarchies. British rule systematically discriminated against black Africans, imposing harsh laws, land seizures, forced labor, and segregation. British settlers dominated economically and politically, marginalizing black Africans harshly, planting seeds of apartheid, racial inequality, and conflict, enduring painfully into modern times. In Central and East Africa, British explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Stanley became famous heroes in Britain, celebrated as daring adventurers mapping unknown lands, spreading Christianity and ending slavery. But reality proved darker. Exploration often paved way for brutal exploitation. Ivory hunting devastated elephant populations, forced labor built railways and plantations, and violence suppressed resistance savagely. In Kenya, British colonizers seized fertile lands violently, displacing Kikuyu and Maasai peoples forcibly, transforming Kenya into settler colony privileging British farmers. Indigenous peoples suffered dispossession, poverty, forced labor, and harsh discrimination. Kenyan resistance grew passionately, culminating decades later in the Mau Mau Rebellion, illustrating empire's violent consequences tragically. Nigeria exemplified Britain's indirect rule strategy, co-opting traditional chiefs, ruling through existing structures, minimizing British administrative costs. Yet indirect rule created profound problems. Chiefs empowered by Britain often exploited local populations harshly, creating resentment, tensions, and instability, enduring long after independence. Quirky historical detail. British colonizers imposed railways across Africa, but often deliberately designed them not to connect different colonies. Each colony exported resources to coastal ports separately, not encouraging intercolonial trade or unity, highlighting Britain's divide and rule strategy starkly. Historians still debate Britain's African empire fiercely. Some argue Britain modernized colonies beneficially, building railways, infrastructure, schools, institutions. Others emphasize brutal exploitation, racial oppression, violence, and deep inequalities still visible today. But most agree Britain's African empire profoundly reshaped the continent, economically, politically, socially, leaving painful legacies enduring powerfully today. Ultimately, Africa's scramble exemplified empire's harshest truths: exploitation disguised as civilization, greed disguised as progress, racism disguised as benevolence. Britain's empire thrived economically, yet collapsed morally, revealing imperialism's darkest realities vividly. Power imposed violently, wealth extracted ruthlessly, dignity trampled brutally. Britain conquered Africa violently, exploited it harshly, but resistance endured passionately. African nationalism surged powerfully, demanding independence, dignity, equality fiercely. Africa's painful colonial legacy endures powerfully, yet resilience, pride, identity emerged strongly too. Reclaiming freedom passionately, empire created profound contradictions: wealth and poverty, progress and suffering, power and oppression, shaping Africa's legacy complexly, painfully, powerfully. Britain's scramble symbolizes empire's deepest contradictions: civilization masking violence, progress masking exploitation, power masking brutality. Britain's empire reshaped Africa profoundly, but resistance reshaped empire powerfully too, reclaiming dignity, freedom, identity fiercely. Empire left painful scars, but resilience, pride, independence emerged passionately, redefining Africa's future courageously, proudly, defiantly. The 19th century brought a transformation that no empire could ignore: the Industrial Revolution, originating in Britain. This seismic shift in technology, production, and society turbocharged Britain's imperial power, turning it from a maritime trading nation into the world's workshop and military superpower. Steam engines, mechanized factories, and new transportation networks didn't just change Britain's economy, they changed the very nature of empire. Britain's industrial boom created an insatiable demand for raw materials: cotton from India and Egypt, rubber from Africa, coal and iron from its own mines, all fed the factories producing textiles, machinery, and weapons. The empire became both supplier and consumer, a vast interconnected economic system where colonies provided resources and markets, while Britain churned out manufactured goods to sell back. Railways were the revolution's backbone. The first passenger railways opened in the 1820s, but soon tracks sprawled across Britain, then across India, Africa, and beyond. Railways in colonies weren't built for locals' benefit. They were arteries pumping resources to ports for export. Yet ironically, these iron roads also facilitate communication, travel, and sometimes resistance within colonies, accelerating social and political change. Steamships replaced sailing vessels, slashing travel times and enabling faster military deployment. The Royal Navy, powered by steam, could project power with unprecedented speed. Telegraph lines linked imperial capitals, allowing near instantaneous communication, a crucial advantage in managing far-flung territories. Industrialization also reshaped society. Urbanization boomed as workers flocked to factories, creating crowded, often grim cityscapes. Britain's middle class expanded, wealth increased, but so did inequality and harsh working conditions. These domestic changes influenced imperial policy, as new social and economic classes demanded political representation and reforms, while elites sought to use empire to distract and unify a fracturing society. Empire and industry fed each other. Colonies supplied cheap raw materials and labor. Britain supplied capital, technology, and markets. This economic interdependence strengthened imperial control, embedding colonies within global capitalist systems. Plantation economies expanded in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. Mining boomed in Africa and Australia. Cash crops like tea, coffee, and sugar flourished. Yet industrialization also intensified exploitation. Mechanized agriculture displaced traditional farmers, forcing migration and social upheaval. Resource extraction devastated environments. New wealth concentrated in imperial elites, while millions endured poverty. Industrial capitalism's brutal rhythms extended colonial inequalities. Globally, missionaries and reformers embraced industrial progress, promoting civilizing missions justified by technological superiority. They claimed empire brought education, health, and enlightenment. Yet these benefits often masked coercion, cultural erasure, and economic extraction. A quirky fact: Britain's Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, showcased imperial industrial might and exotic colonial goods, a glittering display of empire's technological and cultural reach, blending innovation with exoticism, progress with spectacle. Historians debate whether industrialization made empire inevitable, or if empire merely accelerated industrial growth. The truth lies in mutual reinforcement. Industry expanded empire's reach. Empire fed industry's needs. However, industrialization also sowed seeds of empire's undoing. Social tensions, labor unrest, and political movements at home demanded reform. Colonies, increasingly educated and connected, began resisting economic and political subjugation more effectively. The contradictions between imperial exploitation and industrial progress became glaring. By the late 19th century, Britain's industrial engine powered a vast, complex empire, rich, technologically advanced, yet deeply unequal and fraught with tensions. Industrialization didn't just change empire, it transformed the world's economic and political order forever. Britain's empire rode the steam-powered wave to global dominance, but beneath the smoke and steel lay the challenges that would eventually dismantle it. Industry was empire's engine, but also its reckoning. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the British Empire stood at its zenith, vast, wealthy, and seemingly unassailable. Yet beneath this grand facade, winds of change were gathering force, stirring restlessness across continents and challenging the very foundations of imperial rule. Around the world, colonies once subdued by guns and treaties began awakening politically and culturally. Nationalist movements emerged, inspired by ideas of self-determination, democracy, and equality, concepts often introduced through colonial education, but wielded against the colonizers themselves. In India, leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and later Mahatma Gandhi mobilized masses, advocating independence through both militant and non-violent means. Africa saw the rise of intellectuals and activists demanding political rights and an end to racial discrimination. The Caribbean and Southeast Asia similarly brewed with calls for autonomy. These movements were fueled by contradictions within empire. Britain preached liberty and progress at home, while denying those same rights overseas. Colonized peoples recognized this hypocrisy, and their resistance took many forms, from petitions and political assemblies, to strikes, boycotts, and outright rebellion. The British response varied from repression to reluctant reforms, but the empire's grip began loosening. Technological advances made imperial control more difficult to maintain. The spread of print media, telegraphs, and railways not only facilitated British administration, but also empowered anti-colonial activists by disseminating ideas and coordinating resistance. Education created new elites, who questioned colonial authority, blending indigenous identity with modern political thought. At the same time, Britain's own society was shifting. The horrors of World War I, fought largely with colonial soldiers, exposed contradictions and sowed disillusionment. Economic strains, changing class structures, and rising social movements at home pressured politicians to reconsider colonial policies. Public opinion began to waver, with some questioning the morality and cost of maintaining empire. Internationally, new powers challenged Britain's supremacy. The United States and Japan emerged as influential players with differing views on imperialism. The League of Nations promoted self-determination, adding ideological weight to nationalist causes. Britain found itself navigating a complex global landscape where empire was no longer an unquestioned good, but a contested, costly endeavor. Yet, Britain was reluctant to relinquish control. Colonial administrations tightened security, censored dissent, and tried to co-opt local elites. The empire became increasingly militarized, with uprisings in places like India, 1919, Jallianwala Bagh massacre, Kenya, Mau Mau rebellion later on, and Palestine met with harsh reprisals. Still, the tide was turning. A quirky detail: British officials often held elaborate imperial conferences, sporting medals and debating reforms over tea, oblivious to the fact that real power was slipping through their fingers on distant streets and fields. Historians debate whether these nationalist movements were inevitable or accelerated by global conflicts and ideological shifts. Some emphasize colonial mismanagement and arrogance. Others highlight indigenous agency and global currents of change. Ultimately, the winds of change signaled the twilight of empire. Britain faced a choice: adapt and reform, or cling to control and risk collapse. The empire that once ruled vast lands and peoples now grappled with new realities, where control was contested, legitimacy questioned, and independence demanded. The stage was set for the dramatic unraveling of empire in the decades to come. A process marked by struggle, negotiation, violence, and transformation. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire, once a sprawling dominion encompassing vast territories across every continent, was rapidly unraveling. The world had changed, and the old model of colonial rule was no longer sustainable. Yet, rather than disappearing quietly, the empire transformed itself into something else: a commonwealth of nations, a voluntary association of independent states that still maintained symbolic ties to Britain and the Crown. This shift was as much about managing decline with dignity as it was about real political change. It was, in essence, the empire throwing on a new costume, hoping the world wouldn't notice the cracks beneath the velvet cloak. The origins of the Commonwealth can be traced back to the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which granted full legislative independence to dominions like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland. These countries, once colonies, were now sovereign nations, but retained allegiance to the British monarch as head of state. This arrangement preserved a sense of unity and shared identity without the direct control and economic exploitation that characterized traditional imperial rule. The Commonwealth was presented as a family of equals, united by shared history, language, and values. This vision was appealing to many, especially in Britain, which was struggling to come to terms with the rapid loss of empire after World War II. The Commonwealth offered a way to maintain influence and prestige in a world where overt colonialism was increasingly unacceptable. However, this family was not without its tensions and contradictions. The new partners were anything but equal in practice. Britain remained the dominant economic and cultural force, and the symbolic ties to the monarchy sometimes masked profound political and racial inequalities. Countries like South Africa, which pursued apartheid policies, strained the Commonwealth's claims to shared values and unity, leading to South Africa's eventual withdrawal in 19. At the same time, newly independent countries from Africa, the Caribbean and Asia began joining the Commonwealth. India, which had achieved independence in 1947, chose to remain a republic, but still valued its Commonwealth membership. The organization expanded rapidly, becoming more diverse, multicultural, and politically complex. Despite its quirks and contradictions, the Commonwealth became an important diplomatic and cultural institution. It provided a platform for member states to cooperate on trade, education, and development. The Commonwealth Games, a quadrennial sporting event, became a symbol of shared identity and friendly competition, featuring athletes from dozens of countries once bound by colonial rule. Yet beneath the surface, questions about the Commonwealth's purpose and relevance persisted. Critics accused it of being a relic of empire, a way for Britain to maintain soft power under the guise of friendship. Others saw it as a genuine attempt to forge new partnerships based on mutual respect and common goals. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. In Britain itself, the Commonwealth became part of national identity. Immigration from former colonies brought new cultures, foods, and traditions, enriching British society, but also sparking debates about race, integration, and multiculturalism. The Windrush generation, arriving from the Caribbean in 1948, symbolized this new era of migration and the ongoing ties between Britain and its former colonies. Culturally, the Commonwealth inspired literature, music, and art that explored themes of identity, belonging, and post-colonial experience. Writers like Salman Rushdie, V.S. Naipaul, and Derek Walcott grappled with the legacies of empire and the complexities of cultural hybridity. Their works challenged simplistic narratives of imperial glory, revealing the nuanced realities of post-colonial life. At official events, the monarchy continued to play a central role. Queen Elizabeth II became head of the Commonwealth, a largely symbolic position, but one carrying significant weight. Her visits to member countries were often met with enthusiasm and pageantry, reinforcing the sense of shared history and connection, even as political and social realities evolved. A quirky detail: the Commonwealth flag, adopted in 1976, features a stylized globe surrounded by radiating spears, symbolizing unity and cooperation, but also resembling a medieval mace, a weapon of authority. This paradox captures the organization's complex blend of symbolism and power. Historians debate whether the Commonwealth helped soften the end of empire or merely disguised ongoing inequalities. Some argue it provided a peaceful transition, preserving relationships and fostering cooperation. Others see it as a way for Britain to maintain influence without direct rule, perpetuating economic and cultural dominance in subtler forms. Regardless, the Commonwealth remains a living legacy of the British Empire, an evolving institution that reflects the changing dynamics of global power, identity, and history. It's neither a perfect family nor a simple relic, but a complex, sometimes contradictory network of nations linked by shared pasts and contested futures. As the 20th century closed, the Commonwealth continued adapting, grappling with new challenges like globalization, climate change, and shifting geopolitical alliances. Its future remains uncertain, but undeniably tied to the legacies of empire and the ongoing quest for connection and cooperation among diverse peoples. As the British Empire receded from direct political control over vast territories in the mid to late 20th century, its influence did not vanish overnight. Instead, Britain reinvented itself as a global cultural powerhouse, exporting Britishness in forms far subtler than colonial governors and armies. This soft power, expressed through language, media, education, and popular culture, became the new face of British imperial legacy, shaping identities and perceptions across continents. At the heart of this export was the English language. Unlike any other colonial tongue, English rapidly evolved into the world's lingua franca. Former colonies retained English as their official or second language, using it in government, business, education, and law. English's global dominance owed as much to the British Empire's reach as to the rise of the United States as a superpower. but Britain's foundational role remained central. English became a tool of opportunity and exclusion, opening doors for some while deepening inequalities for others. The BBC, Britain's public broadcaster, played an outsized role in this cultural projection. Established in 1922, the BBC World Service became the voice of Britain globally, broadcasting news, entertainment, and educational programs to millions across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The BBC's distinctive accent, style, and perspective shaped how Britain and the wider world was perceived. Its broadcasts often balanced official government positions with journalistic integrity, sometimes becoming a platform for anti-colonial voices, creating an ambiguous space of influence. British literature, theatre, and music also spread widely. Shakespeare remained a global cultural icon, taught in schools from Nairobi to New Delhi. British authors like J.K. Rowling, Ian McEwan, and Salman Rushdie, himself a post-colonial icon, reached international audiences, carrying British cultural narratives to diverse corners of the world. British music, from the Beatles to Adele, became part of a shared global soundtrack, cementing cultural ties. Sports were another powerful export. Cricket, rugby, and football, introduced during colonial times, flourished worldwide. Cricket especially became a cultural bridge, particularly in countries like India, Pakistan, Australia, and the Caribbean, where it evolved into a national passion. Sporting events like the Commonwealth Games symbolized both shared history and friendly rivalry, weaving British influence into national identities. British education systems, both at home and abroad, perpetuated imperial legacies. Prestigious institutions like Oxford and Cambridge attracted elites worldwide, training generations of leaders who often maintained connections to Britain. British-style schooling and curricula were established in many former colonies, perpetuating British values, language, and perspectives. This educational influence shaped governance, legal systems, and cultural attitudes long after independence. Yet Britishness for export was not uncontested or unproblematic. Critics accused Britain of cultural imperialism, imposing its values and norms at the expense of indigenous cultures. Debates over curricula, language policies, and media representation highlighted ongoing tensions between embracing global British influence and asserting local identities. Post-colonial societies wrestled with the legacies of British cultural dominance, seeking to decolonize education, media, and public spaces. At home, British identity itself became more complex. Immigration from former colonies reshaped British society, creating multicultural cities vibrant with diverse languages, cuisines, and traditions. Britishness became a contested and evolving concept, grappling with histories of empire, racism, and integration. Debates over national identity, citizenship, and cultural belonging remain central to Britain's ongoing story. A quirky historical note: British pubs, once symbols of local community life, became global franchises and cultural exports, offering a taste of British social life worldwide, from Tokyo to Dubai. They stand as quirky reminders of empire's soft power, reaching far beyond politics and economics. Historians debate whether British cultural export is a continuation of imperial influence or a genuine sharing of culture in a globalized world. Some see it as a benign legacy, others highlight power imbalances and historical inequalities embedded in cultural dominance. Regardless, Britishness continues to shape global culture profoundly, reflecting a legacy both proud and problematic. The empire's political borders may have dissolved, but its cultural footprints remain vast, complex, and deeply intertwined with contemporary identities and geopolitics. As Britain navigates the 21st century, its cultural imperialism has softened but not disappeared, continuing to influence, inspire, and sometimes irritate millions worldwide. The British Empire, once the largest empire in history, officially dissolved over the course of the 20th century, yet its echoes resonate loudly today, in cultures, economies, politics, and identities around the world. The empire did not vanish without leaving a complicated and often painful legacy, one that continues to shape global relationships, social structures, and national narratives. At the heart of this legacy is the paradox of empire. It brought technological advancement, legal frameworks, and infrastructure to many regions. But it also inflicted deep social scars through violence, exploitation, and cultural erasure. The railways built in India and Africa connected vast territories, but also facilitated resource extraction and colonial control. English common law influenced numerous countries' legal systems, but often replaced indigenous laws and traditions. Colonial education systems produced new elites, yet frequently denigrated local histories and knowledge. Post-colonial nations grapple with these inheritances daily. Borders drawn by imperial powers disregarded ethnic and cultural realities, fueling conflicts and civil wars long after independence. Languages imposed or promoted during colonial rule sometimes replaced native tongues, affecting cultural identity and cohesion. Economies structured around colonial resource extraction struggled to diversify, leading to persistent poverty and dependency. Within Britain, reckoning with empire's legacy has been uneven and contentious. For decades, the empire was taught in schools as a story of civilizing missions and glorious expansion. Recently, more critical perspectives have emerged, confronting slavery, racism, and violence head-on. Debates over statues of imperial figures, reparations, and educational curricula reveal ongoing struggles over how to remember and interpret this past. A significant part of the legacy is migration and diaspora. Millions from former colonies moved to Britain, reshaping its society and culture. This migration enriched British life, but also exposed tensions around race, identity, and belonging. The Windrush scandal, where many Caribbean-born Britons were wrongly detained or deported, highlighted systemic injustices rooted partly in colonial histories. Economically, global inequalities reflect imperial patterns. Former colonial powers often maintained economic advantages through trade, investment, and multinational corporations, perpetuating disparities. Debates about debt, development, and fair trade continue to be influenced by colonial legacies. Culturally, empire's imprint is visible everywhere, from language and literature to food, music, and sports. British English is a global language. Cricket is played passionately in places the British once ruled. Yet cultural hybridity is complex, involving both celebration and contestation. Historians still argue about empire's overall impact. Some emphasize modernization and global integration. Others focus on oppression and destruction. Most agree the truth lies in the complex interplay of power, resistance, and adaptation. The empire's end was not an event, but a process, marked by negotiation, conflict, and transformation. Nations once ruled by Britain now assert their sovereignty, rewrite histories, and redefine identities. Britain itself continues to wrestle with empire's shadow, balancing pride, guilt, nostalgia, and critique. The empire shaped who Britain was and is. Understanding this is essential for shaping who Britain will become. In this complex legacy, hope and pain coexist. Stories of resilience, cultural fusion, and post-colonial success intertwine with histories of trauma, loss, and injustice. Empire is a living memory, one that demands acknowledgement, dialogue, and reckoning. As the sun finally sets on the British Empire, its echoes persist in the languages spoken, the borders drawn, the memories held, and the futures imagined. Britain and its former colonies remain connected, not just by history, but by ongoing relationships of power, culture, and identity. The empire may be gone, but its story is far from over. The vast story of empire is a tapestry of triumph and tragedy, ambition and oppression, progress and pain. It's a story told in the rise of cities and the fall of kingdoms, in the footsteps of explorers and the voices of those they silenced. As we close this chapter, breathe in the complexities. Let the images fade gently, not as simple endings, but as openings for new understandings. Remember that every empire leaves a legacy not just in stone and policy, but in stories and souls. So as the night deepens and the world slows, rest in the knowledge that history is never truly past. It lives in questions asked, voices heard, and truths faced. Good night and sweet dreams.